Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted that you were able to join us for today's Mineta Transportation Institute Research Snaps webinar. My name is Dr. Hillary Nickinson, and I serve as the Deputy Executive Director for MTI. MTI is a U.S. Department of Transportation funded university transportation center at San Jose State University. Our mission is to increase mobility for all by improving the safety, efficiency, accessibility, and convenience of our nation's transportation system. During today's webinar, if you have any questions for our presenters, you can submit them through the chat feature, which will come directly to me. We are recording this webinar, and the link to view will be available after the webinar on our website and social media pages. The COVID-19 public health emergency has affected every aspect of life in California, and severe reductions in social and economic activity have dramatically reduced travel. Government agencies have reported plummeting declines in vehicle miles traveled and the associated fuel sales that generate fuel tax revenues. As we emerge from the crisis and return to normal levels of activity, the state must plan transportation system operations and maintenance in the context of deep uncertainty regarding available resources. Today's webinar presents new research that estimates the impact that different scenarios for economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic would have on state-generated transportation revenues. I was so pleased to see that a number of you submitted questions in advance, which have been sent to our speakers. I do want to emphasize that today's presentation focuses on state-generated transportation revenues rather than other important issues, such as what the future looks like for transit agencies in terms of ridership and fare revenue. As you submit questions, I would ask that you tailor your questions to the topic of the webinar. As you can imagine, there is a great deal of research effort looking into a wide range of issues related to the future of transportation as we look to toward recovery from the current crisis. It gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speakers, Dr. Asha Weinstein Agrawal, Dr. Marty Wachs, and Ms. Hannah King. Dr. Agrawal is the director of the MTI National Transportation Finance Center and also professor of urban and regional planning at San Jose State University. Dr. Wachs is distinguished professor emeritus of civil and environmental engineering and of city and regional planning at the University of California, Berkeley, where he also directed their Institute of Transportation Studies. And Ms. Hannah King is currently a PhD student in transportation and policy at UCLA. So without further ado, we will get started with the presentation. Thank you, everyone. All right, Asha, I think you are first.
Good morning, and thank you so much, Hillary, for the introduction and opportunity to share this work today. This is a project looking at the impact that COVID-19 will have on California transportation revenues. Next slide, please. Hillary, next slide.
Yes.
Thanks. So we had a very basic question, but often the simplest questions are the hardest to answer. How might COVID-19 affect state-generated transportation revenues through 2030? And there are two things I want to clarify about the question. One is that we were not trying to predict what will happen. Rather, we were trying to look at a number of different scenarios about what might happen in terms of future economic conditions and state policies. So we look at a range of scenarios and see in each of these different ones, what would be the impact on state revenues. And next slide, please. That's the second point I wanted to emphasize, which is that we are looking just at the taxes and fees that the state of California itself imposes and collects, and for which the revenue is dedicated to transportation purposes. So those are the Senate Bill 1 package of taxes and fees, which is fuel taxes on both gasoline and diesel fuels, and then also the fees imposed on vehicles. And SB 1 imposed two of these, a transportation improvement fee, with the rate depending on the vehicle value, and all vehicles pay that. And then secondly, a road improvement fee, which is $100 for each zero emission vehicle. Slide, please. And just to set this in context, I wanted us all to remember that while the state's contribution is incredibly important to our transportation system, the state is but one of many partners. And this data is a little, the latest I could get, it's actually from fiscal year 16-17, but you'll see that the state's contribution is about 20%. This is numbers from pre-SB1, so the state's contribution will have gone up a bit. But nevertheless, good to keep in mind that our local partners are also, are raising more than half of the revenue. And then, of course, there's our federal partners as well. And with that, I will turn it over to Hannah, who's going to start with an explanation of our methods. And next slide, Hillary.
Thank you, Asha. So what did we actually do to answer our research question? So like Asha said, we project state-generated transportation revenues each year from 2020 to 2030. And again, like Asha said, that would be the gas excise tax, the diesel sales and excise tax, $100 roadway improvement fee levied specifically on zero-emission vehicles, and the transportation improvement fee levied on all passenger vehicles. Our projections rely on a actually pretty straightforward spreadsheet model we've developed and refined over several past projects. And we've made the models available to anyone who may be interested on the Mineta website, and that link will be made available. And our models incorporate publicly available and widely used data. For example, we rely heavily on data from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, which is used in a lot of research contexts. And our conceptual approach here is to project revenues under several different future scenarios. Next slide, please. So specifically, we compare a baseline scenario that assumes a world in which COVID-19 had never happened to 5 possible COVID-19 recovery scenarios. And I want to echo Asha and emphasize that these scenarios are not intended to predict what will happen. These are not forecasts that would imply a good deal more certainty than our data allow. Instead, these scenarios are really designed to allow us to explore a range of possible futures. And key differences between our scenarios, which again cover the years from 2020 to 2030, include the rates of economic recovery that we assume, and this will directly influence fuel consumption, the number of vehicles purchased, and the type of vehicles purchased. And we also look at different levels of potential policy support to stimulate vehicle purchases, particularly policy support aimed at stimulating purchases of zero-emission vehicles. Next slide, please. So to construct our variables, we had to make assumptions, to construct our scenarios, excuse me, we had to make assumptions about different variables in our models. And key variables include, and these are listed on this slide, 1, the volume of gasoline consumption and how that changes over time. 2, the annual growth rate of the California passenger vehicle fleet. 3, the annual growth rate of the number of ZEVs in California, and the future value of vehicles for both zero-emission vehicles and internal combustion engine vehicles or ICE vehicles. And to sort of construct these assumptions, we examined historical trajectories since about 2008 when data allow, recent trends since the start of the COVID-19 crisis, and in the case of our ZEV registration numbers, the state of California's adopted policy goals. And then based on all of this data, for each variable, we identified a potential high revenue, medium revenue, and low revenue case. In other words, what we did is identify future trajectories for each variable under which it would be expected to generate high, medium, or low amounts of transportation revenues. And I should also mention that not all of our variables are listed on this slide. This slide does not include variables that, while are important to our overall findings, remain the same across all our scenarios. For example, the inflation rate. Next slide, please. And after we had identified our variables and defined their possible future trajectories, we were able to actually construct some scenarios. And what these scenarios represent are different combinations of future trajectories for our 4 key variables. Again, gas consumption, vehicle registrations, ZEV registrations, and vehicle value. We modeled a fast recovery scenario that involves an incentive for ZEV purchases in which all 4 key variables follow their high revenue trajectory. We've modeled a slow recovery scenario in which all 4 key variables follow their low revenue trajectory. And then we modeled a moderate revenue scenario in which all key variables follow their medium revenue trajectory. And We also looked at 2 additional moderate recovery scenarios in which gas consumption follows its medium recovery trajectory, but in which the vehicle market is either stagnated in price and volume or propped up by a ZEV stimulus. And I'm now going to pass things off to Marty, who will discuss our actual findings. Next slide.
Next slide, please. Okay. So the graph to the right summarizes the results of the analysis that Hannah described. And for each scenario, there is a line, and the line is surrounded by a gray area that represents the range of outcomes that occur when that scenario is used with all of the variables in the model. And so you see a slow recovery to 90% of pre-COVID conditions by 2030 at the bottom. And you see the most optimistic recoveries jumping back much sooner into higher levels at the top. And the scenarios range from producing below $9 billion a year to above 11, almost 12 billion per year, depending on what will occur. And remember, of course, that we don't know which of these will occur. These are alternatives that are possible given the way the future will unfold. So the mean projected revenue to 2030, that's per year, ranges from a low of 9.4 billion to a high of 11.4 billion in as we run across the different scenarios. And what's really important is when you add up these annual effects over an entire decade. So the baseline, the black line, which would be what would have happened had COVID-19 not occurred at all. And you notice, by the way, that it decreases over time. And that's because of the anticipation of improved fuel economy from year to year. And the gas tax is the dominant source of revenue. So even with the increases that occurred as a result of SB1, the baseline case would produce less revenue way out into the future because of improved fuel economy. But the baseline would have produced in the decade 118 billion. And the slowest recovery, the least productive recovery, would produce 17% below that, $98 billion. The best scenario would produce 3% more than that. And the best scenario, in terms of revenue, that is, reflects the possibility that the state would offer a stimulus to people to go out and buy vehicles, and that they would acquire fuel-efficient vehicles much quicker than was anticipated under the base scenario conditions. So it's even possible that we can recover and go beyond what was anticipated in the base case. The next slide demonstrates the proportions of the revenue that come from the different sources. So remember that each scenario, and they're labeled, starting with the baseline, each one produces a different total amount of revenue. And this slide doesn't present the total amount, it presents the distribution or the percentages that make up that total. And notice that when we get down here to the bottom right, a quick response and a ZEV stimulus begins to produce revenue from the road improvement fee and the transportation improvement fee that are charged on vehicles, that begins to balance the loss in fuel tax revenue. So the gasoline tax is shown in blue, light blue, and the diesel fuel is the next one, the darker blue. And you see that under every scenario, the gasoline tax is the principal source of state revenue for transportation. But in the most optimistic scenarios, the gas tax is decreased a little bit because we have greater fuel efficiency, but the transportation improvement fee and road improvement fees kick in and help make up for some of those losses. So now The next slide, the final slide, kind of summarizes our findings, the takeaways, and remember that this presentation and the report that it's based on will be all available to you on the Mineta website. The important points to take away are that the total revenue raised does vary considerably and will vary depending on policy changes and changes that are beyond our control. But it can range from a little over 9 billion to a little over 11 billion just within the set of scenarios that we evaluated. And that means a cumulative difference that's as much as $20 billion over the coming decade. Under all scenarios, gasoline taxes generate the most revenue for the state of California, but under the scenario in which there are incentives to purchase electric vehicles, zero emission vehicles can potentially replace and maybe even slightly exceed the lost revenue that comes from the decreased sale of gasoline. And with that, I think we are ready to show you information about the availability of our reports. You can download them and they are here. And we are ready for questions. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Marty, Hannah, and Asha for that presentation. We have received a couple of questions as we have come in. So I'm going to go through a couple of them. I think one of them really relates to kind of what are the state transportation revenues you included? Does it include the new SB1 fee structure, taxes and other fees? And then also, I think related to that, why ZEVs were included. If you could quickly comment on that, maybe Marty or Hannah, since I know you know the data elements quite well.
The sources of revenue that come directly to the state of California were listed on one of the early slides, and you could flip back to that one if you wish. And we did not include, for example, sales taxes, which accrue to 30 different counties because their voters approved sales taxes for transportation. So these are the sources of revenue that one slide before that one, I think. These are the sources, one before that. The sources of revenue. No,
sorry, there.
Yeah, so this constitutes 20% of the revenue that is spent on transportation in California, and the sources that were listed were on the previous slide, the one before this one. And it includes the gasoline tax, the diesel tax. Diesel has both an excise tax, a tax per gallon, and a sales tax, whereas gasoline has only an excise tax, though it's adjusted to correct for inflation every year. And then the fees on new vehicles. Now the question said, why did you include zero emission vehicles? Because the fleet mix can have as few as 50,000 electric vehicles and as many as hundreds of thousands up to depend over the next decade, depending on state policy. And of course, electric vehicles use no gasoline, and gasoline is the principal source of revenue, but they are charged a unique fee because they use no gasoline. So that's why we included zero emission vehicles as variables in the scenarios.
Can I just add on to that? And zero emission vehicles specifically, state of California has stated adoption goals.
Yeah.
And so part of our motivation was just to examine what happens if the state stays on more of its a current and historical adoption trajectory, or what happens if it actually reaches these fairly ambitious goals of 1.5 million ZEVs by 2025 and 5 million by 2030.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you. So there's kind of another question or group of questions that kind of look at when we get these state transportation revenues, but then they flow down to other activities, and there was a specific question about state transportation grants like the Transit and Intercity Royal Capital Program. And what do you think will happen on those, particularly those projects that might have already been approved but might not have had the allocated funds and those kind of things associated with them? Kind of that flow down effect of reduced revenue.
Yes, these programs are all involve funds that are distributed to localities within the state or districts of Caltrans to spend on particular projects. And yesterday there was a meeting of the California Transportation Commission in which it was stated that there will be an evaluation of potential changes to its distributions. It's actually in relatively good shape, surprisingly, because revenue was above forecast for the first quarter and is now plummeting. And the California Transportation Commission said that their highest priority would be to fund the SHOP and the STIP, and they will be deciding at their next meeting how to reallocate funds where they are reallocable.
So, thank you. I think there's another kind of set of interesting questions that look at kind of the vehicle miles traveled. Could this be an impetus for vehicle miles traveled, or even this relationship looking at ZEVs? And as we have increased in the use of zero emission vehicles, could this be the prompting moment to switch to a VMT style user fee? So I don't know, Asha, maybe you would like to take that. I think you're unmuted.
Yes, so it's an excellent question. I don't anticipate that this crisis would move us more quickly towards a VMT fee. As many of our listeners may be aware, Caltrans has had, in the state of California, a very active program, recently completed a major pilot of a mileage fee program and is in the middle of another. My guess is that the general that the state is going to sort of retreat to focusing on basics, at least for the short term until the crisis stabilizes itself. And while work like that pilot will continue, there probably won't be a big appetite for making a huge change in the short term, at least. And also, it's not clear that the current crisis would in any way reduce VMT and vehicle fees more than the mileage fees would be reduced. So I think it's still in our future, but probably not any sooner now than it would have been without COVID-19.
So there's another couple of interesting questions that look at mode shift in a different way. There's been a lot of talk about concerns people have in going back to transit, that may impact transit ridership as people switch to their cars. But at the same time, with employers emphasizing telework programs, could that then put fewer people driving, commuting? So I wonder if, maybe Marty, you could talk about kind of those conflicting scenarios with maybe people not using transit, but at the same time telecommuting more, and what that could play into this state transportation revenue story.
Yes, we do not know how persistent the current high use of substitutes for travel will be over time. Surveys are being performed right now, and people are reporting, 80% of the respondents, 70 to 80% in most surveys, that they want to go back to commuting and that they will not persist in using electronic substitutes for commuting. But those are surveys, and we don't know how things will unfold. My response is that we can use scenarios and use the spreadsheet model to evaluate a wide range of alternatives of these sorts, but we cannot predict with any certainty how this will unfold over time. And I'll just mention one other thing. In addition to the points that were made in the question, at the very same time, the price of gasoline is falling. And we would remember that the revenue is based on an excise tax, which is price per gallon sold. So a falling price of gasoline could actually increase revenue rather than decrease it, even as gasoline consumption rises, because it's a per gallon tax rather than a percentage of the sale price.
Oh, thank you. So there was a specific question, Hannah, this may be a good one for you because it relates to some of the specifics of the models and the scenarios. And so there was a question that asks about the percentage difference in revenues from the various scenarios versus a scenario where the COVID-19 had not occurred. In fact, it's a question from Matthew. I'm not sure if you could read it specifically in your screen, but it's looking at the slow recovery versus the fast recovery plus the ZEV stimulus and whether it reflects the anticipated revenues, things like that. So I wonder if we could just briefly go over those models again. Maybe I can switch to, oh, sorry, that screen. There we go.
Yes, and what were the scenarios in question?
Slow recovery versus the fast recovery.
Okay, and talking through like the percentage revenue results?
Yes.
Okay, so slow versus fast. So in the slow recovery, one of the big differences between these, in the slow recovery scenario, going back to our ZEVs, assumes that the rate of adoption of zero emission vehicles continues at a very slow rate. And so what that means is that one, this fee that's directly levied on zero emission vehicles doesn't generate a lot of revenues, but since we also know that zero emission vehicles tend to have a higher value than equivalent internal combustion engine vehicles, it also means the revenue generated from the transportation improvement fee is not as high under the slow recovery scenario.
Okay.
And the opposite would be true with the fast and the ZEV stimulus.
Thank you, Hannah. So, and then I think there was another kind of question and a couple of questions that are kind of getting at political questions. And there was one that kind of talks about what the likelihood is. And I know that some states have actually been doing this. I've been seeing a report that comes out from a national trade organization that's actually looking at states that have been tapping into transportation revenue for some non-transportation activities, at least maybe kind of borrowing. And has there been any rumblings or conversations about the possibility of the state of California borrowing from the transportation funds to use for other kind of economic recovery, and how you've thought about kind of political objectives in this analysis?
At the California Transportation Commission yesterday, that question was asked of Stephen Keck, who is the Director of Finance for Caltrans, and he pointed out, I think correctly, that the voters of California in 2018 approved by a margin of 81% voting in favor, approved Proposition 69, which explicitly forbids the governor or the legislature to reprogram revenues from under SB1, very explicitly. So if 81% of the voters of California approved such a measure, we think the probability is pretty low that it will actually happen. It happened in the past, and that's what prompted the proposition.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think we have time for just one more question. And I was wondering, you talked about kind of incentives for new car purchases as a potential recovery stimulus measure. Marty, maybe you could address this one. What do you think such incentives would consist of in such a recovery measure?
Is that question for me? For
Yes.
Marty? Okay. I think there are 4 possibilities, several of which have already been used in California. One is a rebate. That is, you go and you buy a car and you get a check in the mail within a month, $2,000, $5,000 or something like that. A second is a tax credit. When you pay your income tax, part of the payment for the car is deducted against your income tax obligation. A third is 0% loans on new cars. And a fourth is forgiveness of paying for your new car for a year or 2 or 3. So you buy the car today, you take out a loan, and your first payment is due in 2 years or 3 years. Those are all incentives that have been used in the past to encourage people to buy cars. And of course, they could be skewed toward electric cars or zero emission cars, or they could be just applied across all vehicles in order to try to re-stimulate economic activity in the auto industry.
And then if I might add just one other thing, there's a lot that local governments and others can do to make it easier to use electric vehicles. So in addition to the purchase incentives, simply having more charging stations and other features like that can also be really important policy complements.
So, well, I am very cognizant that we promised this webinar would be 30 minutes, and we are right at the 30-minute mark. So what I'll do, I know that there are a few questions that we didn't get answered, that what I will try to do is work with our panelists to post, and we've done this before, but to post a response to some additional questions along with when we post the webinar recording itself. So a huge thank you to our speakers. Asha, Hannah, Marty, thank you to all of the participants that attended. We very much appreciate your time, and we hope that you will join us for a future webinar. So thank you very much, and you all have a great rest of your day and stay safe.